Margot had always found the narrow streets of Bellevue both charming and suffocating. The town's old cobblestones were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the buildings leaned in as if sharing secrets. Every morning, on her way to work at the diner, she passed the small antique shop with its dusty glass display. The puppets and marionettes inside seemed to watch her, their wooden eyes frozen in expressions of surprise, delight, or horror. Most days, she averted her gaze, but today was different. There was something new, a puppet that looked eerily familiar. Margot paused, squinting through the grimy glass. The puppet was posed delicately, one arm raised in an almost lifelike wave. Its features were unsettlingly close to those of Ellie, a girl who had vanished from town 2 weeks prior. The resemblance made Margot's stomach twist. She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid, and walked on, trying to forget the sight. But as the days passed, she noticed more changes in the window. A puppet resembling Mr. Harlan, the grocer who had gone missing a month ago, appeared, its expression frozen in a grotesque smile. Her unease grew. One evening, after a long shift, Margot decided to confront her fears. It was a foolish idea, but curiosity gnawed at her. She approached the shop, the street deserted and bathed in the pale glow of street lamps. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of varnish and age. Rows of marionettes lined the walls, their painted eyes glinting in the dim light. "Hello!" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence answered. Margot's pulse quickened. She stepped further inside, her shoes echoing on the wooden floor. Something brushed against her arm, a string dangling from above. She swatted it away, only to realize it was attached to a marionette suspended from the ceiling. The puppet's head turned slightly, as if following her movement. "Margot," a voice whispered, sending a chill down her spine. She spun around, but the shop was empty. Panic rising, she backed toward the door, only to feel it slam shut behind her. She was trapped. The whisper came again, this time louder, echoing from every corner. "We've been waiting." The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the darkness. He was tall and thin, his face hidden beneath a cracked porcelain mask. The shopkeeper. In his hands, he held a bundle of strings, their ends disappearing into the darkness above. "You admire my work," he said, his voice soft and serpentine. "Few appreciate the artistry of control." "What are you doing to them?" Margot demanded, her voice cracking. She wanted to sound brave, but fear paralyzed her. The shopkeeper tilted his head, as if amused by the question. "They're not people anymore," he said, stepping closer. "They're vessels. Puppets who once thought they had control of their own lives. I simply corrected that." He gestured, and the marionettes on the walls twitched to life, their limbs jerking in grotesque movements. Margot stumbled backward, her mind reeling. "Why?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Everyone has strings," he replied, his eyes cold and empty behind the mask. "Some are visible, some are not." Before she could react, the shopkeeper lunged, wrapping the strings around her wrists and ankles. They burned like fire, biting into her skin. She tried to fight, but the more she struggled, the tighter they became. Her limbs moved against her will, manipulated by unseen forces. The shopkeeper pulled the strings with expert precision, forcing her to dance, to twist and turn, as if she were a marionette. The room spun, the walls closing in. Margot's screams were muffled by the strings that wrapped around her throat, cutting off her air. Darkness swallowed her. When she awoke, her body felt heavy, her joints stiff. She couldn't move. Panic surged as she realized she was standing, propped upright in the shop's window. The glass reflected her face, painted, frozen in an expression of horror. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The strings held her mouth in place, her body no longer her own. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of her fate. Days passed. The shop's display changed, new puppets appearing beside her. She recognized them all, familiar faces from town, each transformed, each bound by the shopkeeper's cruel hand. The people of Bellevue continued to walk past, oblivious to the truth lurking behind the glass. One morning, a new figure paused outside the window, a young man, curiosity flickering in his eyes as he stared at Margot's puppet form. Deep within, she felt a surge of despair. She wanted to warn him, to tell him to run, but all she could do was watch, her strings pulling her into place, her painted eyes forever staring. Detective Harris had seen more than his share of strange cases, but this one gnawed at him. Over the past 6 months, people had been disappearing from the outskirts of town. Students, drifters, a retired teacher. Their lives were wiped clean, leaving only whispers and rumours. Each trail, every clue, led him to one place, an unassuming building at the edge of town, a puppet shop, barely a blip on the map. By day, the shop's windows displayed delicate marionettes with painted smiles and intricate costumes. At night, the shop was dark, the glass reflecting only the dim glow of the street lamp. Harris had walked past it countless times, trying to convince himself it was just another dead end. But he knew better. Something was wrong. He felt it deep in his bones. One stormy evening, unable to shake the feeling, Harris decided to investigate. Rain hammered the streets as he jimmied the lock and slipped inside, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with the scent of varnish and decay. Rows of marionettes lined the walls, suspended by strings that disappeared into the shadows above. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. Harris swept the flashlight across the room, the beam catching motes of dust that danced like spectres. A creaking noise echoed from the back of the shop. He followed it, stepping cautiously. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Behind a worn curtain, he found a hidden door, slightly ajar. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But the faces of the missing haunted him. He pushed the door open. The hidden room was a workshop, but not for puppets. The walls were lined with jars of chemicals, surgical tools, and diagrams pinned like macabre trophies. In the centre stood a metal contraption resembling a spider, its limbs ending in needles and clamps. Harris's breath caught. He stepped closer and saw what he dreaded. Marionettes, each too lifelike to be mere wood and paint. One twitched as he approached, its head jerking to face him. "Help," the marionette whispered, its voice weak and broken. Harris recoiled, the flashlight shaking in his grip. He stepped back, nearly stumbling over a hidden wire. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. "Detective Harris," a voice drawled, smooth and cold. The man stepped into the light, a wiry figure with sharp features and a face that seemed to split into an unnatural smile. "You found my workshop." The man wore gloves stained with dark, crusted spots. "Impressive, isn't it?" "Monstrous," Harris spat, drawing his weapon. "You're going to pay for this." The man raised his hands, palms out. "Now, now. Violence won't solve anything." With a flick of his wrist, he pulled on a set of strings that hung from the ceiling. Instantly, the marionettes in the room jerked to life, their movements grotesque and mechanical. Harris fired, shattering one of the marionette's heads. Beneath the splintered wood, something moved, a tangle of nerves and flesh, preserved and wired to the contraption. "They're alive, you see," the man continued, his tone almost conversational. "Well, mostly. The body must be hollowed, modified. The mind, it fights at first, but the strings take care of that." Harris lunged, but the marionettes swarmed him, their limbs stronger than they appeared. Strings wrapped around his wrists, yanking him back. The killer stepped forward, eyes glinting with satisfaction. "You shouldn't have come alone, detective." Harris struggled, muscles straining against the wires. One marionette, its face frozen in a silent scream, leaned close. "He can hear us," it whispered, voice trembling. "He makes us do this." Tears welled in Harris's eyes. These were the victims, trapped, twisted into puppets for a madman's sick game. The killer approached, a scalpel glinting in the dim light. "Your turn," he murmured, slicing through Harris's sleeve. The detective fought, adrenaline coursing through him. He kicked out, knocking over a table. Chemicals spilled, igniting a small flame. The killer hissed, distracted. Harris seized the moment, breaking free and slamming into the man. The fire spread quickly, licking at the walls and consuming everything in its path. The marionettes convulsed, their strings burning. "End it," one gasped, as flames consumed its body. Harris grabbed the killer, dragging him toward the door. "You're done," he growled. The killer only laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. With a final burst of strength, Harris threw the man into the burning workshop. He stumbled outside, collapsing onto the wet pavement. The fire roared behind him, a funeral pyre for the lost souls within. Rain mixed with ash as he watched, numb and broken. In the aftermath, no bodies were found, only ash and charred wood. The shop was gone, but whispers persisted, of a man who escaped the flames, a shadow who still pulled strings from the darkness. Harris knew he would never forget the marionette's whisper, nor the faces of those trapped by strings they couldn't see. Leo had always been fascinated by puppets. As a child, he spent hours carving pieces of wood, turning them into crude marionettes that danced to his tune. But as he grew older, isolation warped his passion into something grotesque. Rejected by the world for his eccentricities, Leo withdrew, opening a small shop on the edge of town. He filled it with puppets, beautiful, lifelike creations that captivated anyone who dared step inside. The townspeople avoided him, whispering about the eerie shop and its strange owner. But Leo didn't care. He had his creations, and that was enough. Until one day, when he realized they were not. He craved more than lifeless wood and painted smiles. He craved perfection. His first masterpiece was an accident. A traveller had stopped by the shop, intrigued by the marionettes. The man lingered too long, his questions too probing. Panic and paranoia consumed Leo. He grabbed a carving knife, hands trembling, and struck. The traveller fell, blood pooling on the floor. As Leo stared at the body, an idea took root, a way to elevate his art. Leo worked through the night, using skills honed by years of isolation. He drained the body's blood and injected a rare neurotoxin extracted from local plants. It paralyzed the muscles, preserving the form. He hollowed out the limbs, replacing bones with jointed wood. Every nerve was deadened, every joint carefully crafted. The next morning, a new marionette stood in his window, a handsome figure with eyes that seemed to plead for freedom. Word of the puppet spread. People marveled at its craftsmanship, unaware of its origins. Leo's obsession deepened. He began to hunt, selecting his victims carefully, those who wouldn't be missed, who wandered too close to his shop. He worked with precision, transforming flesh and bone into art. Each puppet retained traces of its former self, expressions frozen in fear or sadness. The shop became a place of whispered horror. Strangers who visited rarely left. But Leo was careful, methodical, until he met Anna. Anna was a travelling artist, her vibrant paintings capturing the essence of life. She walked into Leo's shop one afternoon, her curiosity piqued by the puppets. "These are incredible," she said, examining one closely. "So lifelike." Leo watched her, a spark of something long buried flickering within him. She saw his work. She understood. For days, he watched her from a distance, torn between admiration and obsession. He followed her to her rented room, learning her routines. Finally, he invited her to see his private collection. She accepted, oblivious to his true intentions. The basement was his sanctuary, filled with tools and half-finished puppets. Anna marvelled at the intricacy, unaware of the danger. "This is amazing," she whispered, tracing her fingers along a marionette's face. Leo stepped closer, heart pounding. "Would you like to be part of it?" he asked softly. Anna turned, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" Before she could react, he pressed a cloth to her mouth. The neurotoxin acted quickly, paralyzing her. He laid her on the workbench, his hands steady. "You'll be my greatest work," he murmured, his voice trembling. But as he prepared the tools, her eyes met his, wide, terrified, and alive in a way his creations never were. Doubt crept in, making his hands shake. "Why?" her eyes seemed to ask, tears streaming down her face. Leo hesitated. For the first time he saw his work through another's eyes, not as art, but as horror. The realization shattered him. He dropped the scalpel, stumbling back. The marionettes around him seemed to watch, their expressions twisted. They whispered, not words, but memories of the lives he'd stolen. He tried to leave, but the whispers grew louder. Strings tightened around his wrists, pulling him back. The marionettes moved, their bodies jerking to life. They surrounded him, eyes burning with silent fury. "No!" he gasped, fighting against their pull. But it was useless. The strings wrapped around his limbs, forcing him to dance, a grotesque parody of life. The next morning, the townspeople noticed a new addition to the shop's window, a marionette with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. Its limbs were jointed, its expression frozen in terror. Leo had become part of his collection, the final touch in a twisted masterpiece. The alleyway was narrow and suffocating, a forgotten corner of the city where few dared venture. At its end stood a peculiar puppet shop with no sign and a cracked window pane. The children of the neighborhood whispered about it, claiming the puppet's eyes moved when no one was looking. Nathan, a young journalist desperate for a story that would launch his career, dismissed the tales as mere folklore. But when two children vanished, and their descriptions eerily matched new puppets in the window, he knew he had to investigate. The shop was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of varnish and decay. Nathan pushed the door open, the bell above it letting out a hollow chime. Rows of puppets lined the walls, their faces frozen in expressions of joy, fear, and surprise. Their eyes, glossy and too lifelike, seemed to follow him as he moved. He shivered, but pressed on, his notebook ready. "Can I help you?" The voice was soft, almost gentle. Nathan turned to see the shop's owner emerge from the shadows, a gaunt man with a pale complexion and hands that seemed too steady. "I'm just curious about your work," Nathan said, forcing a smile. The man's lips curled slightly. "Curiosity is dangerous," he said, his eyes narrowing. Ignoring the warning, Nathan asked about the missing children, his voice steady despite the chill creeping up his spine. The shopkeeper's smile widened. "Would you like to see where the magic happens?" he asked, motioning toward a door behind the counter. Nathan hesitated, but nodded. This was his chance. The door creaked open, revealing a workshop lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were covered in tools, scalpels, needles and brushes. Jars of paint sat next to containers filled with a viscous amber liquid. At the centre of the room was a large work table, and on it lay an unfinished puppet, its eyes wide and unseeing. "Do you know what makes a puppet truly lifelike?" the shopkeeper asked, his voice soft but menacing. "The eyes." He picked up a small jar and held it to the light. Inside, floating in the amber liquid, were what appeared to be human eyes. Nathan's blood ran cold. "You're mad," he whispered, taking a step back. The shopkeeper moved with sudden speed, blocking the door. "Madness? Number perfection!" He gestured to the puppets lining the shelves. "Each one retains a piece of their soul. The eyes are the window, after all." Nathan lunged for the door, but the shopkeeper was ready. A needle plunged into his neck, and darkness claimed him. When Nathan awoke, he couldn't move. His body felt heavy, his limbs stiff. He was seated, propped upright in a chair. Panic surged as he realized he was in the workshop surrounded by puppets. The shopkeeper stood over him, a chisel in hand. "You'll be my finest work," he said almost reverently. Nathan's vision blurred, but he felt every cut, every incision. The shopkeeper worked methodically, hollowing out his arms and legs, replacing bones with jointed wood. Pain blurred with numbness as the amber liquid coursed through his veins, preserving his body. When the shopkeeper leaned in, Nathan saw his reflection in the man's eyes, his own face, pale and lifeless, with wooden eyes staring back. The transformation took days, Nathan's consciousness faded in and out, trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The shopkeeper spoke to him constantly, detailing every step. "You'll see things others can't," he whispered, fitting glass lenses over Nathan's wooden eyes. "You'll be my eyes." When it was done, Nathan was placed in the window, his body posed and his expression carefully moulded. The shopkeeper stood back, admiring his work. "Perfect," he said. "You'll watch over them all." Nathan wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. His mind was trapped, aware of every second that passed. He watched as people walked by, oblivious to the horror behind the glass. Time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights. Occasionally the shopkeeper would bring in a new guest, and Nathan was forced to watch their transformation, unable to look away. One night, a child pressed her face to the glass, her eyes wide with curiosity. Nathan tried to warn her, to make any movement, but his wooden eyes remained fixed. The shopkeeper appeared behind her, his smile cruel and knowing. "Would you like to see the magic?" he asked, opening the door. Years passed. The shop fell into disrepair, but the puppets remained. Locals avoided the alleyway, claiming they felt eyes watching them. Nathan's mind frayed, splintering like the wood that now made up his body. But deep inside, a part of him remained, trapped, aware and forever staring through wooden eyes. Clara's footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets as she made her way to the heart of town. The puppet shop had always drawn her attention, with its colourful displays and whimsical figures. Mr. Felton, the shopkeeper, was known for his charming demeanour and skill with wood and paint. Children loved him, parents trusted him, and his shop had become a cherished part of their small town. But Clara's visit today was different. She was searching for answers. 2 weeks ago, her best friend Eliza had disappeared without a trace. Police searches turned up nothing, and people whispered of dark possibilities. Clara clung to hope, but it was slipping through her fingers. Then she saw it, a new puppet in Felton's window, its painted eyes wide and gleaming. The face was unmistakable. It was Eliza. Clara felt her knees buckle. She stumbled forward, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It couldn't be. She pressed her hand to the glass, heart pounding. The puppet was posed delicately, one hand outstretched as if waving, a smile painted across its wooden lips. Clara's stomach twisted. The smile was wrong, too wide, too lifelike. She turned away, bile rising in her throat. That night she couldn't sleep. Images of Eliza's face, frozen in that grotesque smile, haunted her. By morning, Clara's fear had turned to determination. She had to know the truth. Armed with a flashlight and a resolve she didn't quite feel, she returned to the shop after dark. The streets were empty, and the town's usual warmth felt cold and distant. The door to the puppet shop was unlocked. Clara stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The marionettes on display seemed to watch her, their painted eyes reflecting the beam. The air was thick with the smell of varnish and something metallic. "Mr. Felton?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She moved deeper into the shop, past shelves lined with puppets in every shape and size. Each was meticulously crafted, their expressions frozen in various states of joy and surprise. Clara's breath caught when she spotted a staircase leading down. She hesitated, but then heard a faint sound, like a soft, rhythmic tapping. She descended slowly, each step creaking underfoot. The basement was dimly lit by flickering lanterns. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with paints, carving tools and scraps of wood. In the centre of the room stood a large work table. Clara's blood ran cold. Lying on the table was a partially finished puppet, its limbs jointed but incomplete. Its face, it was Eliza's face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice made her jump. Mr. Felton stepped out of the shadows, a chisel in one hand. He smiled, but his eyes were empty, devoid of warmth. "You have a keen eye, Clara. Eliza was a masterpiece." You did this," Clara stammered, backing away. "Why?" Felton tilted his head, as if pondering the question. "Perfection," he said simply. True beauty is fleeting, but with my art I preserve it. Eliza was special. Her spirit lives on in every stroke of paint, every carved joint. Clara's hand tightened around the flashlight. You're sick. Felton's smile widened. Perhaps. But you must admit, my work is unparalleled. He moved closer, his steps deliberate. I've been searching for a new muse. Someone with fire, passion. You, Clara. You'll be perfect. She swung the flashlight, but he caught her wrist with a strength that belied his age. No need to struggle, he whispered, pulling her toward the work table. It will be painless. You'll be immortalized. Clara fought, adrenaline surging. She kicked over a jar of varnish, its contents spilling across the floor. Felton lunged, but she broke free, grabbing a carving knife from the workbench. "Stay back!" she shouted. He laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "Do you think you're the first to resist?" He raised his chisel, eyes glinting. In that moment, Clara saw the lantern's flickering flame reflected in the varnish. She acted without thinking, hurling the knife into the nearest lantern. It shattered, and flames erupted, consuming the varnish and spreading rapidly. Felton screamed, his arms flailing as fire licked at his clothes. Clara bolted for the stairs, the heat at her back. She burst into the night air, gasping. Behind her, the shop burned, smoke curling into the sky. People gathered, drawn by the flames, but Clara couldn't speak. She watched as the fire consumed Felton's twisted legacy. Days later, as the ashes cooled, authorities found no human remains. They dismissed Felton's disappearance as a tragic accident, but Clara knew better. She couldn't forget the look in his eyes, or the smell of burning wood and varnish. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she heard faint laughter, the echo of painted smiles that would never truly fade. The shimmering lake seemed to beckon, its surface reflecting the fiery hues of sunset. Emily, her husband Jake, and their 2 young children, Ava and Max, stumbled upon it after hours of hiking through dense forest trails. The area was deserted, too deserted for a place so beautiful. It seemed perfect, though, for an impromptu camping trip. They pitched their tent close to the water's edge, ignoring the vague unease that crept up their spines. As they set up camp, a local fisherman appeared, his weathered face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He lingered at the tree line, his posture stiff. "Evening," he said, voice low. "Not many stay here long. Water's got a way of keeping things hidden." Before they could respond, he disappeared back into the woods, leaving an air of tension in his wake. Dismissing the encounter, the family focused on building a fire. Ava and Max played by the water, skipping stones and laughing. When Max waded a bit too deep, he stumbled over something solid and fell with a splash. Gasping, he emerged clutching a metal box, its edges worn and covered in lake grime. "Look what I found," he shouted, proud of his discovery. Curiosity overruled caution. Together they pried open the box. Inside were photographs, each one faded but unmistakable. Smiling campers posed near the lake, their joy preserved forever. But something was off. The photos were marked with red X's scratched across each face. Beneath them were newspaper clippings, detailing disappearances over decades. "This is sick," Jake muttered, his face pale. He wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but darkness had fallen. They decided to stay one more night, planning to report the find in the morning. As the campfire crackled, a strange stillness fell over the lake. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows shifted among the trees, and every whisper of wind felt too deliberate, too cold. "It's just nerves," she told herself, though doubt gnawed at her. In the middle of the night she woke to a sound, a rhythmic splashing, like someone wading through the water. She nudged Jake awake. "Do you hear that?" He listened, frowning. They crept to the edge of the lake, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The water was calm, too calm. Suddenly, ripples broke the surface, and a glistening shape emerged, a massive, scaled head with eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The creature submerged almost instantly, leaving no trace it had been there. Back to camp, Jake whispered, his voice tight. Now. They barely made it when the fisherman reappeared, his face twisted in a sickening smile. You've seen it, he said, stepping closer. Most don't. His hand rested casually on a worn leather belt that held a long knife. It's been here for years, mutated, tainted by the chemicals dumped in this place long ago. I feed it, offerings to keep it satisfied. The truth clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The disappearances, the photos, they weren't accidents. You've been killing people, Emily accused, backing away. The man nodded, as if it were a minor detail. It keeps the peace. The lake demands its share. Without warning, he lunged. Jake grabbed a branch from the fire, wielding it like a weapon. Run! He yelled to Emily. She scooped up Ava and Max, sprinting into the woods. Behind her, she heard the clash of metal and wood, the grunts of struggle. She kept running, heart pounding, until she stumbled upon a wooden structure, an old shack nearly swallowed by vegetation. She ducked inside, gasping for breath. The walls were covered in maps, photos, and hand-drawn symbols. This was the fisherman's lair, a monument to his twisted rituals. The door creaked, and Emily turned to see the man silhouetted against the moonlight, his knife dripping with blood. You can't run, he said, stepping forward. The lake calls. In that instant, a deafening roar erupted from outside. The lake's creature had come ashore, drawn by the scent of blood and violence. Its massive form slithered through the trees, scales scraping against bark. The fisherman turned, momentarily distracted. Emily seized the opportunity, grabbing a heavy iron hook from the shack's wall and driving it into his leg. He screamed, dropping to his knees. The creature's eyes glowed brighter as it advanced. It was massive, a grotesque blend of fish and reptile, its body warped by years of toxic exposure. It lunged at the fisherman, jaws snapping. He screamed again, but this time it was muffled by the crushing weight of the beast's teeth. Emily ran, carrying her children and barely pausing to catch her breath. She found Jake, battered but alive, limping toward the road. Together, they escaped, their minds reeling. When they reached the nearest town, they tried to warn the authorities, but their story was met with skepticism. The campsite was searched, but no evidence remained. No shack, no photos, and no sign of the fisherman or the creature. Years later, rumours of the lake persisted. Locals spoke of ripples that appeared when the wind was still, and of a shadowy figure who sometimes watched from the tree line. But no one stayed too long. The lake's secrets were best left undisturbed. The wind whistled softly through the pines as Jack and Laura pulled into the clearing. They were eager for a weekend escape from the city, a chance to breathe fresh air and disconnect from their hectic lives. The campsite, nestled deep within a grove of towering trees, seemed perfect. A faint trail led from their spot into a cluster of abandoned tents, their weathered fabric fluttering in the breeze. This must have been popular once, Laura mused, brushing her hand along a tent's frayed edge. Jack nodded, but unease crept in. Something about the campsite felt frozen in time, as if the occupants had simply vanished. They chose to camp a short distance away, unpacking their gear and building a fire. The pines loomed above, their needles blotting out the sky. As dusk settled, the couple explored the area. They stumbled upon a ring of stones, an old fire pit, surrounded by cracked bones arranged in strange patterns. Animal bones, maybe, Jack suggested, but the uneasy look in Laura's eyes mirrored his own thoughts. The bones were too large, too human-like. That night, they lay in their tent, listening to the wind rustling the trees. Sleep was fleeting. At some point, Laura awoke to a noise, a soft rhythmic scraping. She nudged Jack awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He strained to listen. It was faint but unmistakable, like claws against stone. He grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. The darkness swallowed the beam almost immediately, but something shifted at the edge of the light, shadows flitting between trees. "Stay here," Jack said, his voice low. He stepped outside, shining the flashlight in a slow arc. Nothing moved. Just as he turned back, A sharp pain erupted in his leg. He stumbled, the light revealing a rusted trap clamped around his ankle. He screamed, and Laura rushed out. Blood pooled around the metal teeth, and as she knelt to help, she noticed something. The trap was clean, as if freshly set. A twig snapped. They both looked up to see a man standing at the edge of the clearing. He was tall and gaunt, draped in tattered clothes that blended with the forest. His face was pale, eyes sunken and hollow. In one hand, he held a shovel, its blade glinting in the firelight. "Help us!" Laura cried. The man tilted his head, as if considering the request. Then he stepped forward, his movements stiff and mechanical. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping the ground. "This place belongs to the Bones." He raised the shovel, but Laura lunged at him, adrenaline surging. She knocked it from his grip and they fell to the ground, grappling. Jack crawled toward the tent, bloodied and weak. He found a small hatchet among their supplies and threw it to Laura. She caught it, swinging wildly. The man staggered back, a deep gash across his shoulder. He didn't bleed. Instead, a black tar-like substance oozed from the wound. The man retreated, melting into the shadows. "We have to leave," Jack gasped, his leg throbbing. With Laura's help, they packed what they could and stumbled away, following the faint trail that had brought them there. The forest felt alive, branches clawing at them, roots tripping their every step. They soon realized they were going in circles. The clearing reappeared, the abandoned tents standing like silent sentinels. The fire pit now glowed faintly, embers crackling without flame. And the bones, they had moved. They formed a ring around the pit, each one pointing inward. The man stood at its center, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "He was the caretaker," Laura whispered, the realization dawning. This was his campsite. Decades ago, he had been tasked with watching over tourists, but something had twisted him. A lifetime spent inhaling toxic fumes from the nearby mines, isolation warping his mind. He had become a guardian of the dead, a collector of bones. As they watched, he began to dig, his movements methodical. The ground gave way, revealing shallow graves filled with skeletal remains. "Join them!" he hissed, advancing. Jack and Laura fought desperately, but the man seemed inhumanly strong. Each time they struck him, more of the tar-like substance oozed out, but he never slowed. Laura grabbed a burning log from the fire pit and swung it at him. Flames caught on his tattered clothing, spreading quickly. He shrieked, a sound that pierced the night. For a moment it seemed they had won. But the ground beneath their feet began to shift and crumble. Hands, skeletal and clawed, emerged, grasping at their ankles. With one last burst of strength, they broke free, dragging themselves toward the trees. Behind them, the man and his graveyard burned, the flames consuming everything. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, bloodied and gasping. The authorities found nothing when they returned with help. No bones, no fire pit, just an empty clearing. Locals spoke in hushed tones of a caretaker who had vanished long ago and of a campsite where people sometimes disappeared. Jack and Laura left and never returned, but the memory of bones beneath the pines haunted their every step. They knew that some places, once claimed by darkness, never truly let go. The red ribbons fluttered gently in the wind, tied to branches and posts along the narrow trail. They caught the light in a way that made them appear almost alive, beckoning travellers deeper into the forest. For Daniel, his wife Lisa, and their two children, Ben and Katie, the ribbons were a curiosity, a forgotten path marker perhaps, meant to guide hikers through the dense woods. They had planned a family camping trip, a chance to bond and disconnect from their busy lives. The trail seemed perfect, winding through towering pines and offering stunning views of the distant mountains. As they walked, Ben ran ahead, his laughter echoing through the trees. "Stay close!" Lisa called, her voice tinged with unease. The ribbons unnerved her. Each one had a strange symbol etched into it, marks that looked like scratches or crude carvings. By late afternoon, they found a clearing and set up camp. The air was cool, and the scent of pine needles mingled with the smoke from their small fire. But as night fell, the forest's demeanour changed. The wind howled, carrying faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was Ben who noticed first. "Mum, Dad, look." He pointed to the trees around their camp. More ribbons had appeared, tied to branches that had been bare hours before. Each bore the same strange symbols, now glowing faintly in the firelight. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but his unease grew. "Let's just enjoy the night," he said, forcing a smile. "It's probably some weird prank." But sleep was impossible. Lisa awoke to a faint rustling sound. At first, she thought it was an animal, but when she stepped outside the tent, she found their supplies shredded, food scattered across the ground. Deep claw marks gouged the earth. She backed away, her pulse racing. "Daniel," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Something's out there." Before he could respond, a shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, hunched, and moved with a predator's grace. Daniel grabbed a flashlight, its beam catching a glimpse of the figure's face. It was human, or had been once. Its skin was leathery and scarred, its eyes wild and bloodshot. The creature hissed, revealing yellowed teeth. "It's a person," Lisa gasped, her voice trembling. But as the figure stepped closer, it became clear it was something more. Years of living in isolation, exposure to toxic elements, and unending violence had twisted it. The trail was its territory, and the ribbons were warnings. Daniel held a camping knife in one hand, his other arm shielding his children. "Stay back!" he yelled, but the figure lunged, moving with unnatural speed. It swiped at him with claw-like hands, narrowly missing. The family scrambled, their hearts pounding. "Run!" Daniel shouted. They sprinted down the trail, the red ribbons flashing past like bloody markers. The creature followed, its guttural growls echoing through the woods. Branches clawed at their clothes, and the ground seemed to pull at their feet. Ben stumbled, but Lisa scooped him up, her adrenaline overriding her fear. As they ran, they stumbled upon old traps, crude snares and sharpened stakes hidden beneath leaves. Some were empty, but others held skeletal remains. The realization struck Daniel like a punch. The trail wasn't just marked for travelers. It was a hunting ground, and they were the prey. They reached a fork in the path, both directions marked by ribbons. "Which way?" Lisa cried, panic in her eyes. Daniel hesitated, every second feeling like an eternity. A distant growl made the decision for him. "Left," he said, pulling her forward. The trail narrowed, branches closing in around them. Suddenly, a trap snapped shut, spiked metal teeth inches from Lisa's leg. They stopped, breathless. The creature was close, its ragged breathing filling the air. It stepped into view, eyes glinting with a sickening hunger. "Leave us alone!" Daniel shouted, brandishing his knife. The creature paused, tilting its head. It spoke, a rasping, broken voice. "Leave! None leave! This! My trail!" It stepped closer, and Daniel realized there would be no reasoning, no escape without a fight. He charged, swinging wildly. The blade caught flesh, and blackish blood oozed from the wound. The creature roared, its strength unmatched, but Daniel's desperation fueled him. "Run!" he yelled again. Lisa pulled the children away, their screams mingling with the sounds of struggle. They ran until they collapsed, lungs burning, tears streaming. The forest fell silent. Hours later, as dawn broke, they retraced their steps, finding the trail littered with broken traps. The creature was gone. Of Daniel, there was no sign, only a red ribbon tied around a tree, freshly marked with new symbols. The authorities never found him. Locals spoke in hushed tones of a trail deep in the woods, where the trees whispered, and red ribbons warned of a predator that once was human. Lisa and her children never returned, but every night, in their dreams, they saw the ribbons and heard the whispers of the marked trail. The forest swallowed sound. Deep in the heart of the trees, where sunlight barely filtered through dense branches, a group of friends, Mark, Eleanor, Travis and Sophie, found themselves standing before a forgotten campsite. They had strayed from the main trail hours earlier, their map proving less reliable than anticipated. Weary and desperate for rest, they agreed to stay the night. The campsite was peculiar, too intact for something abandoned. A stone fire pit sat at the centre, ringed by logs worn smooth by use. Rusted lanterns, dangling from low branches, swayed in the light breeze, emitting metallic creaks. Mark, ever the skeptic, brushed off their unease. "Probably just an old hunter's camp," he said, shrugging off a chill that neither wind nor logic could explain. While the others set up tents, Elena wondered. Something about the place felt wrong. Her eyes caught on the trees surrounding the camp. Names were carved deep into the bark, dozens of them. Beneath each name was a date. Some carvings were old, weathered almost smooth. Others looked fresh, their cuts clean and raw. She traced one with trembling fingers. Michael A. 1978. Her hand dropped when she saw the newest carving. Elena M. 2024. "Guys!" she yelled, sprinting back to camp. "We need to leave, now!" They dismissed her panic until she showed them the carving. Silence fell. Mark's bravado cracked. "It's a sick joke," he muttered, though his eyes darted nervously to the trees. As dusk descended, shadows stretched and deepened. They decided to keep watch in shifts. Elena insisted they leave at first light. Night brought no peace. Travis was on watch when the first sound came, a faint raspy whisper, like wind rustling dead leaves. He stood, flashlight trembling in his grip. "Who's there?" No response, just the whisper, closer now. He stepped beyond the circle of lanterns and saw movement, a shadow slipping between trees. He followed, heart pounding. Minutes passed. When Travis didn't return, the others grew frantic. They called his name, their voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. The whisper returned, louder, almost mocking. Mark, armed with a camping knife, led the search. They found Travis's flashlight first, its beam weak and flickering. Next, they found him, hanging upside down from a tree, eyes wide with terror. Blood dripped steadily, pooling at the roots below. Elena screamed. Mark pulled her away as Sophie collapsed, sobbing. "We have to get out of here," Mark insisted, fighting his own rising panic. But the forest seemed to close in around them. Paths they had walked earlier twisted and changed. The campsite's dim lanterns became their only point of reference. The whispering grew. Shapes moved in the darkness, too fast, too quiet. Mark swung his flashlight wildly, catching fleeting glimpses, pale limbs, sunken eyes, faces etched with hollow grins. "It's a trick," he whispered to himself. "It's just fear." But it wasn't fear alone. The truth became clear when they stumbled upon an old journal buried beneath rocks. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but they pieced together enough. The campsite had once been a refuge, a guide's base for tourists venturing deep into the woods. Until something changed. The guide turned on his clients, hunting them for reasons that had become twisted and lost with time. The forest became his domain, and the campsite, his lure. Those who stayed too long became part of his game. "He's out there," Sophie whispered, clutching the journal. "He's watching us." "Then we fight," Mark said, though fear choked every word. They reinforced their small perimeter, lighting every lantern they could find. Hours passed in tense silence, but the whisper never stopped. When the attack came, it was brutal and swift. Shadows darted in, slashing with crude blades and clawed hands. Mark fought desperately, but the figures knew the terrain. Elena was dragged into the trees, her scream fading quickly. Sophie tried to run but tripped on exposed roots. Cold hands grabbed her, pulling her into the darkness. Mark was the last. Bloodied and broken, he stumbled back to the fire pit. "Show yourself!" he screamed. The whisper ceased. A figure emerged, a man, gaunt and wild-eyed, wearing scraps of clothing layered over years of filth. His smile was a jagged slash. "You stayed too long," the man rasped. "Now, you're mine." Mark lunged, but the guide was faster. The knife fell from his hands as he hit the ground. Pain exploded in his chest. The last thing he saw was the guide carving a new name into the tree. By morning, the campsite looked untouched. The lanterns swayed gently, and the fire pit was cold. When the next group of hikers stumbled upon it, they saw the carvings and laughed, unaware they were the next names to be etched into the trees.